So, you've probably heard that supernovae create the building blocks of life, right? But here's the twist. They're also unbelievably destructive. And that creates this major accounting problem for astronomers. There's a recent paper that's been getting some buzz because it suggests a surprising turn in this story. Where a supernova happens might be way more important than we realized. So, what does this study actually say? Let's break it down. Okay, so let's start with the big picture. The whole thing revolves around this question of cosmic dust. We're talking about tiny, tiny grains of solid stuff just floating around between the stars. It's the raw material for the next generation of stars and planets. So you can see why figuring out where it comes from and where it goes is, absolutely fundamental to understanding how galaxies like ours work.
And right away, we hit a snag. When astronomers peer out at faraway galaxies, they see tons of dust. A lot of the time, it's more dust than our best models can really explain. It's a puzzle often called the cosmic dust budget problem. It's like we're looking at the books, and it seems like we're running a deficit. The numbers just don't add up.
Now, supernovae are right at the heart of this whole puzzle because, yeah, they can forge new heavy elements and create some dust, but out in the interstellar medium, their main job seems to be destruction. The insane shockwaves from these explosions tear through space, and they just obliterate the very dust grains that took other stars ages to create.
And, as the author of this paper points out, this isn't just some local problem we have here in the Milky Way. Nope. It's a challenge for understanding galaxies all across cosmic time. If our numbers for how much dust a single supernova destroys are wrong, then our entire accounting for how galaxies evolve could be off.
So, this brings us to the very specific question these scientists wanted to answer. They wondered, is the amount of dust a supernova destroys just a fixed number? Or does it actually depend on the neighborhood it explodes in? Things like how dense the gas is or what its chemical makeup is.
To figure this out, they couldn't just, go and watch a supernova up close. So they did the next best thing. They built one inside a computer. They ran a whole series of really complex 3D simulations to model a single supernova explosion, and then just carefully tracked what happened to all the dust around it.
The main way dust gets destroyed in these events is a process called thermal sputtering. Okay, here's a way to think about it. Imagine a dust grain is a sandcastle. The superheated gas from the supernova is like a hurricane-force wind. This wind just relentlessly blasts the sandcastle, eroding it one grain of sand at a time. That's pretty much thermal sputtering, and it works best when the gas is scorching hot, over 1,000,000 degrees. So their method was super methodical. First, they built a perfectly smooth cloud of gas in their virtual box. Then they tweaked its key properties, how dense it was and its metallicity. After that, boom, they set off their virtual supernova right in the middle. And finally, the most important part, they just watched and measured exactly how much dust got worn away by that thermal sputtering process over millions of years.
This table here shows you the main dials they were turning in their experiment. They tested a massive range of gas densities, from the super thin stuff you'd find way out in the galactic boonies to the really dense clouds where stars are born. They also played with the metallicity, which for an astronomer is just a fancy way of saying how many heavy elements are in the gas. And for most of these tests, they kept the dust grains all the same size, which helped them isolate the effects of the other variables.
Okay, so let's get to the good part. What did they actually find? Now, your gut instinct might be that denser gas means more dust, which should mean more destruction, right? But what the simulation showed was something, well, a lot more complicated and honestly a lot more interesting.
So let's just ask that question point blank. If you have a supernova that goes off in a really dense cloud, does it destroy more dust than one in a thin, spread-out cloud? Well, the simple answer from the study is no, actually it doesn't.
And the reason why is pretty cool. It turns out there are these two competing effects. So, on one hand, in a low-density gas, that super hot, destructive phase of the supernova remnant lasts for a really long time. But the sputtering itself is slow because there just aren't that many hot gas particles around to do the work. On the other hand, in a really high-density gas, the sputtering is incredibly efficient, but the gas cools down so fast that the whole destructive phase is over in a blink. So neither extreme is perfect for destroying the most dust.
Which leads to the absolute key finding of this paper. The most dust destruction happens at a Goldilocks density. It's an environment that's just right, not too thin and not too thick. It's dense enough for that sputtering to really work, but not so dense that the hot bubble fizzles out before it can get the job done.
And the simulation even put a number to it. They found that the peak destruction was around 13 times the mass of our sun's worth of dust. And what's really fascinating is that this peak happens at a gas density that's pretty similar to the average density of the gas just floating around in our own Milky Way.
You can see it perfectly in this chart, which is based on a figure from the paper. Over on the left, in the low-density gas, you get about 8 solar masses of dust wiped out. On the right, in the high-density gas, it's around 9. But look right there in the middle, that Goldilocks zone. You see that obvious peak at 13 solar masses? The amount of destruction isn't a straight line. It's what scientists call non-monotonic.
Okay, now this next part is really, really important. Good science is all about understanding the limits of what you found. The authors here are super clear about the limitations of their model, and we have to understand them to get the results right.
So let's be really precise. This study is not saying it has solved the cosmic dust budget problem. Not at all. It's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Remember, the simulation used a perfectly smooth gas cloud, but the real universe is messy and clumpy. It also focused on just one way to destroy dust, thermal sputtering, and didn't include others. And finally, this is only about destroying dust. It doesn't model any new dust being created by the supernova itself.
And just to add another layer here, the researchers ran a second set of simulations. This time, they factored in that the dust grains themselves can actually help cool the hot gas around them. And when they did that, the total amount of destroyed dust actually went down. Why? Because that extra cooling just makes the destructive hot phase even shorter, which ends up protecting some of the dust.
So what's the big takeaway? Why do astrophysicists find this so interesting? Well, it matters because it helps us refine our recipe for how galaxies are built. It tells us that you can't just think about the supernova itself, you have to think about its local neighborhood, because that turns out to be critically important.
And this quote from the paper really says it all. A supernova that goes off in a really dense, busy star-forming region, like the ones in those early intense galaxies, will actually destroy less dust than one that goes off in a quieter, more spread-out part of a galaxy like ours. That is completely the opposite of what you might just intuitively guess.
So let's bring this all home. We've looked at the question, the method, the findings, and all the important caveats. Now we can go back to our first question, what can we responsibly say based only on this one paper?
And here it is. The calm, scientifically grounded takeaway is this. The destructive power of a supernova is not a constant. You can't just plug one number into your big galaxy models and call it a day. Instead, it's a variable that changes, a lot, depending on the density and makeup of the gas it explodes into. The local environment matters.
And that leaves us with one last, really fascinating question to think about. We know the very first galaxies were these crazy places with incredibly intense, dense star formation. So if supernova in those environments were actually less destructive than we thought, could that help explain how those early galaxies got so dusty so fast? This study doesn't answer that question, but it gives the scientists trying to figure it out a crucial brand new piece of the puzzle.